I'm Nicola Shongwe. Welcome to another lesson on narrative writing. The most important parts of a story are the beginning and the end. If the beginning is effective, the reader will want to continue. If the end is effective, the story will remain in the reader's mind. But how do we begin and end stories? I'm going to be looking at some effective techniques for beginning and ending stories that you can use in your narrative writing. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to use various techniques to begin narrative essays and end narrative essays more effectively. Let's begin by looking at some good techniques for beginning a narrative. The techniques that we're going to go through will be demonstrated through the use of examples that would be suited to a science fiction story or an account of something going wrong in a science lab. So the first technique you could try is to incorporate an action. For example, you could say, "I spun around and rubbed my eyes as the machine came to life. This was not what I expected." This immediately brings the reader into the action and starts the narrative off in a lively way. One way of using action to begin your narrative is, instead of giving all the background information first, you start with the action and then have a flashback to show how you got to that situation in the first place. Another technique you can use is dialogue. Our lab story could be introduced in this way with, "Here goes nothing," I said as I reached for the controls. Using direct speech is often far more effective than using indirect or reported speech. It shows you the character's exact words and makes it easier for the reader to visualize the action. If you don't want to use dialogue, you could try and use a sound. Sound effects provide an effective hook to your introduction. For example, fizz, kaboom, zing, whoosh, sparks and smoke filled the laboratory. Again, this is a good way of getting the reader involved in the action. This technique is especially effective for stories that will be read to children or large audiences. If you want to get your reader thinking, you can begin your narrative by including a thought or question. Here's an example of this technique. Something had gone very wrong. Maybe this was not such a bright idea after all. You will see how this technique gets the reader curious as to what the story is about. They will want to read on to see what went wrong or to find out how the question is answered. A further technique is to try to set the scene. Describing the setting will help to formulate a picture in the reader's mind. It will also help them to guess what type of story this is. Here's an example. The laboratory looked so clean and clinical with its shiny stainless steel surfaces. It looked like the sort of place where there was always perfect calm and order. Another technique for introducing your narrative is to introduce a character. When you describe a character, it helps the reader to establish what sort of people the key players are, so that you will understand their behavior and speech later on in the narrative. Here's an example. The Nobel Prize had always eluded Professor Kleinschmidt. He had devoted his life to science. It was his passion, his reason for living. Effective openings of narratives can use one of the techniques that we've discussed, or they can use a combination. We're now going to have a look at an extract from a book entitled A Short Walk in the Hindu Kush by Eric Newby, in which he successfully uses a combination of narrative techniques to describe a seedy hotel room. This is how the extract goes. "Room for two," said the proprietor, flinging open a door at the extreme end. He contrived to invest it with an air of extreme indelicacy, which in no way prepared us for the reality. This extract begins with direct speech, which immediately draws the reader into the action. These words are what a hotel owner or manager might say to guests under ordinary circumstances. But in this case, the room is not what hotel guests might expect. By saying that the proprietor or owner tried to invest the room with an air of extreme indelicacy, the reader is given a hint that the room will be disgusting. The suggestion that in reality it was even worse than they expected it to be also makes the reader imagine what it was like. The extract continues. "It was a nightmare room, the room of a drug fiend or a miscreant, or perhaps both." The adjective nightmare is not used often to describe a room. Through the use of this powerful adjective, the reader sees just how bad the room actually is. The scene is further set by describing the type of people who might have stayed in a room like this. Drug fiends and miscreants are both unsavory characters. All of the stereotypical run-down motel rooms that we see in the movies suddenly flood into the reader's mind. Let's read on. "It was illuminated by a 40-watt bulb and looked out on a black wall with something slimy growing on it." This sentence gives some details and leaves others out on purpose. A 40-watt bulb does not give out much light, so the reader knows that the room was dim and had a sinister atmosphere. Newby then says that the wall had something slimy growing on it. Saying this, instead of saying that moss or algae were growing on the wall, also helps to paint the picture of the room being dirty and disgusting. The description continues. "The bed was a fearful thing, almost perfectly concave. The sheets were almost clean, but on them there was the unmistakable impress of human form, and they were still warm." Again, even uncomfortable beds are seldom described as being fearful. By describing the bed in this way, the author exaggerates his horror of having to sleep in a bed that a stranger has slept in without the sheets having been replaced. Talking about the sheets as being still warm emphasizes the fact that they could not have been washed. Let's continue. "In the corner, there was a wash basin with one long red hair in it and a tap which leaked. Somewhere nearby, a funfair was testing its loud-hailing apparatus, warming up for a night of revelry." In this section, using details such as the color of the hair helps to create a vivid mental picture and also to reinforce the idea that the room has not been cleaned. Describing the noise of the funfair shows both that the room was noisy and also provides a contrast between the author, who is clearly horrified, and the people who would go to the funfair without a care in the world. Let's see how it continues. "The smell of the room was the same as the corridor, with some indefinable additions." In this final section, Newby describes the smell as being indefinable or unable to be identified. This would also cause the reader to wonder what the smell was, and in this environment, we certainly are not expecting something pleasant. Other than the techniques that we have discussed, you may have noticed that Newby uses other techniques in his introduction. For example, he makes use of descriptions of 4 of the 5 senses. He has incorporated Sight. He describes what he saw in the room, the concave mattress, the dim lighting. Smell. He refers to the smell of the room as being the same as the corridor, but with indefinable additions. Hearing. The sounds that he hears are mentioned, the loudhailer of the funfair. Touch. He also indirectly mentions what he felt, a sense of horror, and that this experience was a nightmare. Descriptions that combine the different senses are an effective way of developing a narrative. Another technique Newby uses is to use lots of detail. Instead of stopping at describing it as a nightmare room, he goes on to talk about the kind of light bulb and the color of the hair in the basin. All of these are details which help us to clearly picture what the room looked like. But then, don't bore your reader by including too much detail. You may want to just add a few bits here and there or hint at details and then let the reader fill in the rest in his or her mind. Once you've introduced your narrative in an exciting way, you'll want to keep the pace up right till the end. So here are some effective ways of ending your narrative. A memory or feeling. Show how the main character remembers the main event or how he or she feels about it. A decision or defining action. Include a decision made by the main character as a result of the main event or story problem. A wish or hope. A character or the narrator may express a desire for the future based on something that has happened in the story. A moral or lesson. These are common in children's stories or folk tales. Think about stories like The Hare and the Tortoise. The moral or lesson would be, slow and steady wins the race, a lesson that the reader or listener could apply to everyday life. An exciting twist. The action may suddenly have an unexpected turn. For example, you may realize that the story you were reading was actually a letter or a suicide note. Again, the best way of demonstrating these techniques is to look at an example. You may be familiar with the novel The Great Gatsby by F. Scott Fitzgerald. In this novel, Gatsby built up an empire from nothing in order to impress Daisy, an old love. Daisy, however, has married and had a child, but still, Gatsby hopes that if he holds lavish parties in his mansion across the lake from her house, eventually she will return to be a part of his life. The commentator in the story is Nick, Gatsby's neighbor and a cousin of Daisy. At the end of the book, when Gatsby has failed in his quest, Nick comments, "And as I sat there, brooding on the old unknown world, I thought of Gatsby's wonder when he first picked out the green light at the end of Daisy's dock." The green light is a symbol that is used throughout the book to represent Daisy. Gatsby knows that she lives just across the lake from him, but like the light, she can be seen but not touched. She will always be out of Gatsby's reach, yet Nick now reflects on just how excited Gatsby must have been when he realized that this woman who was his fantasy lived so close to him. By mentioning that he sat there brooding, the reader gets a sense that the commentator is reflecting on the action of the novel. The passage continues. He had come a long way to this blue lawn, and his dream must have seemed so close that he could hardly fail to grasp it. He did not know that it was already behind him, somewhere back in that vast obscurity beyond the city, where the dark fields of the Republic rolled on under night. Here Nick reflects on the fact that in part, Gatsby has built up his fortune and empire just to impress Daisy. Yet, he has already lost her, and like the green light, she is close but unreachable. Nick, as the narrator, is able to tell the audience what they already knew, that for all of his efforts, Gatsby never stood a chance. Gatsby believed in the green light, the orgiastic future that year by year recedes before us. It eluded us then, but that's no matter. Tomorrow we will run faster, stretch out our arms further. And one fine morning, here Nick includes a thought that applies to Gatsby and many readers. When he mentions the green light, he is referring to the belief that if you can see something and try hard enough to get it, you will. But in most cases, these objects that we unrealistically desire will elude us. The final line reads, "So we beat on, boats against the current, borne back ceaselessly into the past." This final image is one that readers are able to picture in their minds. F. Scott Fitzgerald conjures up an image of how Gatsby continues to fight the current, or the way that life goes, in an attempt to reach something that has long since slipped past his grasp. This image is so beautifully articulated that it will stay in the reader's mind. It shows that the story does not end happily ever after, as the main character, Gatsby, still has to discover what the narrator already knows. Well, that ends our lesson on effective introductions and conclusions. Now it's time for you to write something on your own. For today's task, choose between the two genres, romance and action, and write an opening and closing paragraph for a short story that incorporates as many of the techniques we have discussed as possible. I hope you enjoy your task, because the best way to improve your writing is to write. Reading is another way to improve your writing. As you read through essays, short stories, and novels, look out for techniques that the author uses to hook the reader at the beginning and to keep them thinking at the end. See you next time.